Alright, so today we've got another highly anticipated laptop review. This is the 2025 Asus Zephyrus G14. And while a lot of it is the same as last year's 2024 model, which I've also covered on my channel already, there are a couple of changes this year. And I'm going to cover a lot more than the typical reviewer because just like the G16, which you can find the review for on my channel, just about everybody has left out some pretty critical details on this laptop right here. So let's get into it. And for those of you who want a sleek and clean desk to go with that sleek and clean G14, well, FlexiSpot has got you covered and they sponsored today's video. This is the FlexiSpot Q8 standing desk. What I like about this one is, first of all, it's a bamboo top, so it's not that cheap particle board that, isn't sturdy at all. This is real bamboo, guys. And it was super easy to set up. If I wasn't taking my time, I probably could have had this whole thing set up in like 10 minutes. I also like that this one has a drawer that pulls out so you can put something here, like a keyboard or, Oh, okay, that's better. Like a ROG Ally or something like that. You have charging ports here. You have Type A, which is 18 watts out, and then you have a Type C one with 45 watts out, plus a 10-watt wireless charging point hidden under the tabletop, which is awesome for just, setting your phone down and letting it charge while you're working on your laptop or whatever. Plus, it has a 220-pound capacity, so, here I am just sitting on the desk, and it'll go all the way up to its tallest height and all the way down just fine. The twin motors really help so that it's not super slow, going up and down, and it's not super loud either. And the cable organizers that come with it are really convenient for just, routing cables so you can have a nice clean look underneath. So yeah, you can get this in a few different sizes, a few different colors. Overall, I've always loved FlexiSpot desks. That's what I use as my current main one that you see in all my reviews. So yeah, go check it out, especially if you're watching this as I posted it. There's a huge sale happening right now with their Amazon Prime store. So go check that out. I have links in the description. Get yourself a good discount there. And thank you again, FlexiSpot, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. I have the RTX 5070 Ti and 5080 models right here, but I'll also try to give you an idea of how the 5070 or 5060 model will perform as well, so hopefully you'll be pretty well informed no matter which one you're going to get. Now, the most notable GPU option here is the 5070 Ti, so stick around to see why I actually prefer this one the most. It's got the semi-new AMD HX 370 CPU, which we already saw on last year's 2024 Zephyrus G16 AMD model, and we loved it, right? It's an amazing CPU, and I know we typically see HX being like the non-efficient laptop chips, which isn't the case here. Honestly, it's just AMD's naming scheme, which is just so backwards now that you literally have to study it like you're watching a story explanation video on YouTube for a Quentin Tarantino movie you just saw. Regardless, it's very important that we call this what it actually is. This is an efficient CPU. That means it does really good at low wattages and battery scenarios. Unlike the true HX counterparts that you're going to find in thicker laptops like the Legion 7i or Omen Max 16, think of this as the equivalent of an H chip on Intel like the 285H. And the powerhouse chip from AMD is like the 9955HX, which, is going to be terrible on battery. But anyways, these have 32 gigabytes of LPDDR5X RAM is soldered, but you can configure it up to 64 gigs apparently. So I can't be too mad about it being soldered this year since you actually have some higher configuration options. I just wish they were customizable at checkout or something, because honestly, I couldn't even find the 64 gigabyte model anywhere in the US, while other regions seem like they've gotten that. So that's kind of weird, but whatever. Now for ports, we've got HDMI 2.1 on the left side here, so 4K 120 Hz output directly from the GPU, so that allows G-Sync to your monitor. You've got your power jack, your USB 4 is on this side, so Thunderbolt compatible with DisplayPort 2.1, which is an upgrade over the 1.4 that you see in a lot of other laptops. If you plug a monitor into that port, it's going to run through Optimus, so it's going to hit the integrated graphics first before it hits the GPU. This means no G-Sync out, but you'll still get FreeSync out of here, and it's helpful for if you're like connecting to a monitor on battery, so that way it doesn't drain super fast. Next, you've got your USB-A 3.2 Gen 2, and then your audio jack. And then on the other side, you get USB-C 3.2 Gen 2, which actually this one connects directly to the NVIDIA GPU, so you do get G-Sync out of here. You get another USB-A Gen 2 port, and a micro SD card reader where the card actually fully goes in, unlike the full-size SD card readers that you usually see where they're like poking out. This one goes all the way in, and that's kind of helpful for like if you're trying to put like a 512 gig one in there and store like pictures, videos on it, things that you don't need a lot of speed for. Also, both USB-C ports offer power delivery 3.0, so that any 20 volt 5 amp charger is going to be able to power it up to 100 watts. And I'll show how that affects performance later. And as far as the design goes, just like its 16-inch counterpart, it's easily one of the best looking gaming laptops on the market. So in the 14-inch gaming laptop space, it does not get any thinner or lighter than this, weighing in at 3.46 pounds. The only one that comes close is the Razer Blade 14 at 3.59 pounds, but that only goes up to an RTX 5070. And the G14's 5070 model and 5060 model actually are even thinner and lighter than this one because they don't have the little bump right here. So if we instead compared the Blade 14 to its equivalent G14, then it's looking even worse for the Blade because those are only 3.31 pounds. Insane for a 14-inch gaming laptop, which makes laptops like the Legion Pro 7i or the MSI Raider HP Omen Max, they look comically huge next to something as like thin and light as this. This is like a D1 athlete, right, next to like a freaking really OP baby or something. But try to carry both in one hand and you'll see like this is way easier than trying to hold this guy. I mean, this is like literally nothing. So yeah, I mean, whether it's in your lap or in your bag, it cannot be understated just how incredibly portable this thing is right here in comparison to anything like this, especially with their 400 watt power supplies that you're seeing now on these laptops. You're like talking twice the size, twice the weight. If portability is your top concern, you really can't beat this. And the white color is pretty sleek, and there's also a dark gray finish like the G16 that you see right here, but just keep in mind, you know, the dark gray is going to attract more fingerprints. Still not as much as like a Razer Blade will though. I actually got a 5060 G14 right before this review was published, so here's a few clips of comparing the two. They're actually so hard to tell apart in person. Like, other than this tiny little bump on the bottom side of the 5070 Ti and the 5080, it's like they're pretty much identical. And I've said it before, like some people love the slash and some people hate it, but you know, it is what it is. It has some different lighting effects that you can do with it, or you can just disable it completely. But I mean, honestly, it's kind of grown on me and I sort of like it now. Also, like I said in my G16 review, people have completely over exaggerated the hinge wobble last year, but I actually was pleasantly surprised to see that it's quite a bit tighter. Like the G16's was a little bit tighter, but the G14 is very tight now. Like it feels really good and there's minimal wobble on this guy. And then the typing experience is once again amazing. It's the same great keyboard as last year's model, and in my opinion, it's one of the best gaming laptop keyboards. It's got 1.7 millimeters of key travel, which is really good for a 14-inch laptop, and I mean, it feels amazing to type on. And now this is all subjective, of course, so like I get it, some people like other keyboards more than this. These are just personally my favorite, other than the Copilot key that they're putting like in every single laptop now. Not just these, but if you're like me, you're gonna remap that thing back to Control immediately. And then the Trackpad is also one of the best out there. It's roomy, it's made of glass. And then again, like I said in the G16 review, I don't think people give enough credit to laptop brands who actually put glass trackpads in their $2,000 plus laptop. Like that needs to be the standard, really. And it seriously feels so much nicer than like a plastic trackpad. Like those things really just make your laptop feel so cheap. Reason. I mean, come on, it's 2025. Put the glass trackpad in your $3,000 laptop. All right, 2025 Zephyrus G14 webcam. See how it handles light in the background. Yeah, it's not bad. Yeah, about the same as G16. Now internally it's looking great, like nice big vapor chamber, liquid metal on the CPU, you have Asus's PTM on the GPU, and if you get a good paste job from the factory, then you're all set, like for years. But you've only got one SSD slot, and you know, the stock one is really fast and you can easily replace it with like a 4 terabyte or 8 terabyte if you're crazy, so not a huge deal honestly, but you know, it's nice to have something swappable here. And, you know, I prefer 2, but I mean, it's 14 inches, so I can't complain too much. So the display is the same great display that we saw on last year's model, the G14. It's a, I guess, 3K, 1800p OLED display. So a little higher resolution than 1600p that we see on the G16 and most other 16-inch gaming laptops. Kind of a weird choice, and I think that's only because this is the only 14-inch OLED display that Samsung makes. That is one thing I am a little nitpicky about with this laptop, and I'll talk about more in a second. But yeah, it's the same exact panel as last year, about 450 nits of brightness in SDR, and then it tops out 700 nits peak brightness in HDR. No matter what, it could be a full white screen or a 10% window. so that's really cool. It's actually very bright for HDR on OLED. Color gamut is of course really good, 100% DCI-P3, nearly 100% Adobe RGB, so this is a very vibrant, very color accurate screen with a delta E of 0.75. These also have a really good anti-reflective coating, which I prefer over something like the Blade 16 or the Legion Pro 7i, which have almost no anti-reflective coating on those. Like those are pretty much just a mirror in comparison to the G14 and G16, which both have the same exact coating on them. And yes, it does have sort of a bluish green tint at like certain angles when the screen's off, but like that's not really anything you would ever notice. And I'll gladly take the better reflection handling for that slight trade-off. The G16 and G14 both have a S-stripe subpixel layout, so really good for text clarity and OLED and burn-in prevention. That along with like the pixel refresh that's built into the laptop itself. Personally, I'm not worried about burn-in on these. And I really don't think anyone else should be unless you're like, you know, blasting max brightness, HDR, 700 nits, full 100% all the time with the brightest UI elements stuck in the same spot forever. And even then, it still might not burn in. Like these are really good displays. I've had the 2024 G16 for over a year now, no burn in, and I keep that thing pretty much near max brightness all the time. There's only a couple downsides to this display. So at lower brightness levels, you will see a little bit of graininess on the grays. It's just the nature of this display. Samsung makes it, and it's in like every other OLED gaming laptop. Like they all have the same little graininess on certain shades of gray, but only at lower brightness levels. I legit don't even notice it, and I forgot it was even a thing until I was making this review. But then the second downside is of course the 1800p pixel count. To be honest, this was one of my biggest nitpicks with the 2024 model as well. It's like, I just think it's unnecessary, especially at 14 inches. Like you're not gonna notice a slightly higher resolution on a 14-inch display compared to 1600p on a 16-inch display. Like I've had this thing side by side with the G16 and other laptops for so long. I've never noticed a difference in clarity despite that higher pixel count. All it leads to is less FPS in games. So what I highly recommend to anyone who buys this laptop is just go ahead and lower it down to 1600p in games, or even 1200p. You know, you probably wouldn't even notice 1200p that much on a 14-inch laptop. But for me personally, I always put every game at 1600p on this laptop. You can see there's actually a decent difference in FPS. You almost get like a whole GPU upgrade just doing that. Like look at this, 105 FPS on Forza Horizon 5 at 1800p, 118 FPS at 1600p, and it looks exactly the same. And in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, you go from 116 to 133 FPS, and in Cyberpunk, you go from 51 FPS to 58. So yeah, it is not worth the slightly higher pixel count to me. Like just drop it down to 1600p and do yourself a favor. Oh, also when you're in DGPU mode, you actually get a bunch of refresh rate options in Windows. You get 120 Hz, 100 Hz, 75, and 60. This is only in DGPU mode though, so when you're in Optimus, it's only 120 and 60. It's super weird. I wish it was the other way around, but yeah, thought that was interesting. Now, just like last year's, it has the same amazing speakers that you've heard, and yeah, these are incredible. For a 14-inch laptop, they sound just like the G16s, and a lot of people like them better than like MacBook speakers. I think they're pretty close. I mean, this is the best Windows laptop speakers I've personally ever heard, so still in 2025, this is the gold standard. Here's a sound sample.
Laptop speaker test. Laptop speakers. Take care of the air. These laptop speakers sound so loud and clear. Can you hear the noise? Did your eardrums get destroyed by these laptop speakers? Yeah, they're playing for you.
All right, as far as software goes, I've talked about Armoury Crate a million times, so I'm not really going to go into too much detail here, but overall, I find Armoury Crate to be actually one of the better laptop softwares out there, other than being a little bit confusing on where things are located. It did get a recent facelift, and it made it a little bit harder to find like the GPU power modes, like standard, ultimate, optimized, all that. But if you do want an explainer of how that all works, I have a G-Helper video that actually talks about all of these settings in detail, what they mean, and then how to find them on G-Helper and optimize them on there as well. And then for those of you curious about the BIOS settings, there's not much available, but I'm quickly skimming through it here just so you can see it. Alright, so fan noise is where I am the most disappointed with this laptop, as well as, you know, the Zephyrus G16, if you saw that review. Kind of the same thing here. Actually, it's a little bit louder than the G16 on all performance modes, which is a huge bummer. And that's something I've kind of noticed across the board with a lot of newer gaming laptops, is like, you know, things are kind of being pushed to the edge. But even like some of the thicker laptops, like Legion Pro 7i, they run pretty loud, at least in its turbo mode. But the G14, where it's really struggling, is its silent mode and balance mode fan noise. This thing is definitely definitely louder than last year's model and way louder than the 2023 one. So before we get into this, for those of you who don't know, decibels scale a little bit differently, right? So 50 decibels is like double the loudness of 40 decibels. So for every 10 decibels, it's a 10 times increase in intensity of sound and a 2 times increase in perceived volume. So that's a big deal. That means every 1 decibel is a noticeable increase in volume. Like you can hear a very audible difference between, say, 50 decibels and 51 decibels. So that's why I think it's really important to map this out in respect to each power profile that is built into the device. Now, of course, you can fix this completely actually with G-Helper. Like you can easily lower the fans in silent mode or lower the fans in balance mode, lower the fans in turbo mode, and get just about the same performance at slightly warmer temperatures. I just know, of course, Asus was doing this. Everyone's doing this. They're raising those fan speeds because they're tired of people complaining on Reddit. Hey, my CPU is running too hot. Hey, my GPU is running hot. Oh my gosh. Even though it's not actually affecting performance or throttling or anything, people get concerned when they see, that CPU hitting like 95 degrees or whatever, even though it's designed to do that, but I'm almost positive this is a response to people possibly like returning their laptops in regards to, what they perceive to be high temperatures, even though that was what was designed by the manufacturer. Anyways, that tangent can be like a whole video in itself, and I might actually do that. But regardless, all right, here's the fan noise to time spy graphics ratio chart. This is like my pride and joy, okay? So this is a chart I built to really illustrate how much performance you get for each decibel of fan noise. A lot of reviewers leave this out because they don't think people care, but like if you're a laptop user, if you're in a library, if you're bringing this over to your family's house or your friend's house, like you don't necessarily want to be running at max fans, So that's where I think this chart really comes in handy, and it really helps show like, some laptops might perform better on paper, but it's really because they're just running their fans louder. So that's kind of what this is supposed to illustrate. So on the left here, you've got your fan noise in decibels. Remember, every 1 decibel is a pretty big increase in volume. And then on the right is your time spy graphics score. So basically how much performance you get in games divided by that fan noise. So this is how many points you get. Think of it like FPS, right? This is like a scale of how much FPS you would get in a game for every 1 decibel of fan noise added. So starting with turbo mode, your highest performing fan profile. The G14 5080 is looking pretty poor here. It's underneath the M16 4090, which had super loud fans. It's under last year's G16 4090. It's under G14 4090. Like it gets really good performance, but the fans are loud at 52.5 decibels. 5070 Ti model is a little below that, even at about 300 points per decibel. And it's still, of course, beating out all these 4070s because they, of course, just cannot reach that same graphics score. But I would have loved to see these top out at like 49, 50 decibels like we see on the Flow X16 or even last year's G14. Okay, so balance mode. G14, again, is like right in the middle of the line here. 5080 models hitting 310 points per decibel, which, is a good lead over like the 70 Ti and most other 4070s. But still, as far as like fan noise goes, it's still not as good as like the 2024 G16 or 2023 G14 4090. Those were hitting way lower fan noise in their balance mode while offering, similar performance. So yeah, your fan noise just goes a lot further in those laptops. 5070 Ti model, it's right down here with some 4070s now. 5070 Ti model, 273 points per decibel. It's pretty much up there now with the 47. Not that it's like performing worse than them, it's still getting more performance, but 50.5 decibels in balance mode. That is the equivalent of a lot of these laptops turbo modes. So to me, that's just unacceptable for a balance mode to be that loud. And I know they're trying to make temps look better, but like, come on, that's crazy. That is loud, and you can definitely hear that from the next room over at 50.5. Last year's G14, for example, 43.5 in its balance mode. That's night and day quieter. So I don't know. I mean, this might be different for like the 60 and 70 since those have a lower TGP here, but that was probably one of the most disappointing balance modes I've seen other than like Blade 16. And that was the first one that I went to go fix in G-Helper whenever I got it. Silent mode, this is where things just get bad, right? For the 5080 model, it's running its GPU below 45 watts, so the performance is just bad. The fan noise is oddly high at 41.5, making it one of my loudest silent mode laptops I've ever had. Same with the 5070 Ti model. At least it's like scoring a little bit better because the 5070 Ti is a bit better at lower wattage, but still 41.5 decibels is crazy for a silent mode. Like we ideally want to see silent mode around 35 decibels. Anything over 40, say you're in a room gaming or you're exporting a video or something, that's enough to be heard by several people in the room for sure. It's hard for me to even call this silent mode. That is a must fix in G-Helper, unfortunately, unless some kind of BIOS update hopefully comes out in the future that fixes that. right, so battery life. Battery relies a lot more on the CPU than the GPU. This is one of the most efficient Ryzen laptop processors you can get, especially in a gaming laptop. And yeah, you're gonna get great battery life. I'm only getting like 7 to 7.5 watts of discharge on idle, which is the equivalent of 10 hours right there. And it doesn't take much to get there. I do see a lot of people mess up their settings trying to get lower battery life. It doesn't have to be super complicated. Just all I usually do is silent mode, eco mode, Windows power saver. Of course, turn off any background tasks or apps that you have open, disable as many startup tasks as you can, and then just regular YouTube playback. I'm getting about 8.5 watts of discharge, which is about 8.5 hours of battery life. And that might increase a little bit if I'm doing like basic tasks, checking emails and scrolling through Reddit, things like that. It can go up to like maybe -10, at the most like -11 watts of discharge. So that's when you're going to see it get about like 7 to 8 hours of battery life. But overall, I mean, that's really good for a 14-inch laptop with only a 73 watt-hour battery. The G16 with the Ultra 285H actually does beat this. The 285H is a great CPU for efficiency as well, and I think the big advantage there is the G16 just has a larger 90 watt-hour battery. So, even though they both run at about the same discharge rate when doing basic tasks, you just have a bigger battery on the G16. So it comes out ahead, getting about 9 hours or more. Either way, though, this is granting you way more battery life than the equivalent like power-hungry CPU that you see on these thicker laptops like the 275HX. Those are getting you like anywhere from like 4 hours to 6 hours. So yeah, we're doing a lot better than that. And I want to quickly talk about USB-C pass-through. There's a lot of conflicting arguments here from people on whether there is pass-through on this laptop. And I'm not going to claim to be the USB pass-through expert here, but I'm just going to show you my observations. I have a USB-C cable that shows you the wattage going into the laptop. Then I'm using hardware info to show you the wattage that is going to the batteries. So I'm not super sure if this is true pass-through. I noticed on the G16 that, my cable was saying that it was putting in like the watts or so, while hardware info was reporting 0 watts of charge, which I believe that's what you want to see. However, I was getting this weird result where I was getting 0 watts of charge from the cable and 0 watts on hardware info. But then after like 5 minutes, it spiked to saying it was charging like 20 watts or so. And then the cable was saying it was putting in about 50 watts. All right, so if you've seen my G16 AMD review from 2024, then you likely already know this CPU. And it's the same exact CPU, nothing has changed. 12 cores, 24 threads. It's the first efficient AMD chip to have over 8 cores, which is amazing to see. We love that because AMD is really good with efficiency. They were always just missing out on the core count that Intel always had. And while it still doesn't quite match the core count of the Intel Core 285H, it does, however, beat it in benchmarks. And, not by much. I mean, it's getting about like 1,500 to 2,000 more points in Cinebench R23, which is like the gold standard of CPU benchmarking. And that's running at about 80 watts. And I'll tell you about the wattage here in a second because that's actually the more important part. Sure, on this chart, it doesn't look nearly as good as like a 13900HX or, of course, like the Core Ultra 275HX, right? But it actually beats those in a lot of scenarios, and I'll show you why in a second. And it starts to become more obvious in this chart, balance mode and silent mode, where we're seeing it run at a lower wattage. The HX370 is now near the top of the charts here. And then in silent mode, we've passed almost every Raptor Lake, and we're almost even tying with the 275HX in the much thicker, much less battery-friendly Legion Pro 7i. It's the same deal on battery, right? We're pretty much top of the charts here. Only thing beating it is the AI Max 395 Plus and the Flow Z13, which I really wish they had put in these laptops. Like, that would have been amazing. And I'll show you why in a second to even further solidify that point. And then real quickly, USB-C power delivery prefers CPU over GPU, so we're actually getting quite a bit of CPU performance here. And I take Cinebench 24 with a grain of salt because I don't feel like these results really track with how the CPU actually performs. Cinebench 24 takes into consideration a lot of other things like memory and stuff like that. But, it's still looking pretty good here. 1231 compared to like 1222 on the G16's 285H. Okay, now for the most important graph when it comes to laptop CPUs, and that is the power scaling of the CPU. This is important because this is why MacBooks are so good, and I'll show you guys in a second. Like, this is the reason why I tend to choose efficient CPUs over, ones that value peak performance like in much thicker laptops. So this is how much CPU performance you're getting for every 10 watts that is given to the CPU, right? So the higher your performance is, further to the left here with lower wattage, that's what means, better battery life, better temperatures, better performance in games without having to use so much CPU power. This is everything for a laptop. Maybe not a desktop. Desktop users don't care. They just want to see peak numbers. They don't care how much wattage it uses. Laptop users, we want cooler temps. We want quieter fans. We want really good CPU performance at 20 watts, right? Because to be honest, that's where it normally sits in games, is that 20 to 40 watt range. And that's where this CPU dominates. You can see it on the yellow line here. We're surpassing, the 275HX all the way up until 40 watts. We're surpassing the 285H like the whole way through. And of course, we're surpassing, older Ryzen CPUs here as well. And then when you look at, Raptor Lake chips, the 13900HX, it's not even close. All the way up until like 190 watts. This laptop CPU performs way better than those until you get to this crazy high range that you rarely see in games. The only thing outperforming it, of course, is that new AI Max 395 Plus. Strix Point Halo, right? Best laptop CPU I've ever used by far, and I really wish it was in this laptop. I really wish they had used this CPU here instead of only on the Flow Z13. Like, look at the performance on this guy, all the way up to 130 watts where it stops. Like, it beats out even the highest peak performing 275HX laptop CPU all the way through. It's crazy. And it does that while being an efficient battery friendly chip. But anyways, that's enough on that CPU. Just really wish they would use it in more laptops because it is incredible. Regardless though, the HX375 is pretty close to it all the way up until about 40 to 50 watts where they start to veer off from each other. And the HX370 kind of flattens out. It doesn't really get much performance after about 50 watts. But man, that 10 watts, that 20 watts numbers, like, man, we're getting like double the performance of some of these other CPUs at that level. And that's why the G14 can leave its CPU running at like 15 to 20 watts in games and still be fine. Now I'm throwing in MacBooks here too, just to show you like that we're basically around the equivalent of like a base M4. We're surpassing an M3 Pro and we're surpassing the 12 core M4 Pro as far as like efficiency and power per watt, because that's typically where these higher tier CPUs from Mac really just kill it. And now we're going to switch over to the next most important CPU graph for laptops is single core scaling. So this is how well your laptop can handle single threaded tasks, and you know, a lot of games and applications are this way, especially on battery. The HX370, which is the pink line here now, surpasses the AI Max Plus up until about 25 watts. So it is one of the best single core laptop CPUs, which is really helpful for performance on battery. And I'm throwing MacBooks in here again because this is where Mac dominates. This is why you see MacBooks getting like almost equivalent performance unplugged as they are plugged in. The M3 Pro, for example, is hitting the equivalent of the HX370 at 25 watts when it's only using 5 watts. So Windows does have a long way to go here, but this is a step in the right direction. And lastly, with this chip, I need to talk about core-to-core latency because that was a problem when the HX370 first released, and it was affecting gaming performance a little bit. That's why it wasn't always coming out ahead in comparison to some other similar laptops. But I'm happy to say that issue has been fixed. AMD was working with manufacturers to fix this, and it was a BIOS update or something that went out, but now we're looking at about 62 nanoseconds of CCD latency, which, you know, it used to be just about double that. So overall, it's looking good. I have no complaints anymore. When it comes to the GPU, I think almost every review I see gets it wrong on the G14. So the 5080 and the 5070 Ti models go up to 120 watts on the GPU. Almost everyone is out here saying 110. And to be fair, Asus's website even says 110 watts, and like for some reason they don't advertise this, but there's an extra 10 watts that goes to the GPU in manual mode, and you get this for free if you're just using G-Helper. You can just use it in turbo mode, you can use it in silent mode if you want. But I would strongly encourage other reviewers, just open NVIDIA control panel and look at the maximum TGP on the system information tab. Easy as that. And a lot of these reviewers don't even run it with that extra wattage. I see so many reviewers just run it in its performance mode, which is basically balance mode, or turbo mode, which isn't hitting the full wattage either. So it's like, what I'm about to show you is probably going to be the most accurate representation of how these GPUs actually perform. So for example, a lot of people were bringing up this Crimson Tech video to me where he showed, you know, the 5070 Ti, 5080 G14 performing about the same. And I think what might have happened here is because the performance mode on the G14 5070 Ti does pretty much match the 5080's performance / balance mode, just because of a slight difference in tuning. However, if you run them both at their turbo mode, their manual mode with the full wattage going to each GPU, it's not the same. So I think that was just a slight oversight on his part. No offense to the guy, I love his channel, but I'm just saying, like, or who knows, I mean, maybe he did have them in turbo mode and maybe one was like defective or something. Not really sure, but either way, super cool dude, and I just wanted to correct that for other viewers to not be misinformed and to not get the wrong idea here. There is a performance difference between these two GPUs. Plus, he jumped the gun pretty early on that review, so I think he might have even had an earlier BIOS where they weren't running at their full wattage, so it may not have like fully been his fault. Also, a lot of people think that, you know, a 5080 just runs hotter because it's a higher tier GPU. That's not the case. An RTX 5080 has a larger surface area, which actually gives it better cooling performance compared to a 5070 Ti. So as long as they're both running at the same wattage, the 5080 will always run cooler than the 5070 Ti. You know, so people are like, oh, the 5080 throttles, don't get that one. Don't get the 5080, it runs too hot for that laptop. It's actually the opposite. The 5080 runs cooler than the 5070 Ti. So just another rumor out there to squash. And I have video of that happening in the temps and wattage section. So starting with 3D Mark Time Spy, which I don't really trust the CPU scores in this one anymore, so I just leave that out and I only measure graphics scores. Because 3D Mark for some reason shows like the HX370 at like 9K on the CPU score when that should not be happening. Like there's no way. It's a really good CPU and it performs way better than one that would score 9K. And I've noticed that across a few CPUs, so I'm leaving that out. I only do graphics score on TimeSpy because it gives a much more accurate measurement of how this will perform in games. Because this really is about where it typically falls, except for with a few minor surprises that you're going to see in the gaming benchmarks. So the 5080 G14 comes in about 17,603, which is just a little bit less than the 4090 G14, 4090 G16. So a lot of people saw that score and they were like, oh, this thing isn't worth buying. I'm just going to get the 4090 G14, which I get that. But you're going to see in the gaming benchmarks a different story a little bit. 5070 Ti, same case here. Pretty much tied with the G16 at about 15.7K, which is amazing. So much better than the 4070 laptops that we're used to getting. So I love how this GPU is like a good middle ground between a 4070 and a 4080. And you'll see in games that it even surpasses the 4090 G14 and G16 sometimes. And yeah, I know that 5080 at 120 watts looks nowhere close to the 5080 at 175 watts. You know, unfortunately, NVIDIA promised better efficiency. They did not deliver on that promise. These are not super efficient GPUs at all. So yeah, they do love wattage, but NVIDIA also kind of pulled a fast one on us and barely gave us more performance at that 5080 and 5090 level. You know, even looking at the Omen Max here, 25 compared to about 21.6 on a full wattage 4090. I mean, it's not bad. It's a 17% increase. Does that actually translate in games? Sometimes. I mean, this is a 2-year difference though, you know, and NVIDIA's out here promising like you're getting 4090 performance from a 5070. Nah. And it looks like the 5060 model scores a little bit over 11K in TimeSpy, which puts it right around like a 4070 laptop, maybe just slightly lower than a 4070 laptop. So great job NVIDIA again on making the 60 series GPUs not that great. So in balance mode, the G14 with the 5070 Ti is scoring really well here, pretty much matching like the full wattage 4080 Legion Pro 7i from 2023. But unfortunately, once you drop it into silent mode, that performance goes down by a lot. You can surpass this by using G-Helper and making a custom silent mode, but I just wanted to show, you know, the stock silent mode on these guys is not great. On battery, they're both not great, but not bad either. It's just sad they're getting beat out by some 4070 laptops here. That's just because the 5080 and 5070 Ti, once they hit like below 40 watts, they start to really go down in performance. They're not efficient at that lower level. And the 5080 G14 for some reason is a little worse on USB-C power delivery than the 5070 Ti. You know, looking at about 7,000 compared to like 8,000. Not too much, but there is a weird difference there. Not sure why. Steel Nomad tells an interesting story here. The 5080 G14 is just barely ahead of the 4090 G14 and the 4090 G16. And then the 5070 Ti is pretty much tied with the G16's 5070 Ti and a little bit ahead of like 110 watt 4080. You know, this benchmark isn't the most accurate, unfortunately. Like in games, you're going to see a much different picture here. The 5070 Ti G14 pretty much ties with the 4090 G14 in like almost everything. So take this with a grain of salt. All right, so temperatures and wattage. I try to make this as easy to replicate as possible on your own system so that you can tell, you know, how it would compare to the laptop that you currently already own. All I do is I just run the free Shadow of the Tomb Raider demo benchmark. I turn DLSS off and I turn it on the highest preset. I don't change any other settings, just the preset, just change it to the one called highest. And that's how I measure GPU bound temperatures, which gives you a reflection of how it's going to perform in games like Cyberpunk or Black Myth Wukong or Expedition 33, things like that. And then I do it on the lowest preset, set it to 1080p, and that'll give you an idea of how it's going to perform in more CPU bound games like Apex Legends, Counter-Strike, Valorant, things like that. And I'm a little bit annoyed because I actually had to recut this part. I guess I had like a bugged out AMD or NVIDIA driver on both of these that was like causing all the power profiles to run at the same wattage. So I had to go back and redo this, which was super time consuming, but you know, it's fine. You know, maybe like hitting the subscribe button would help me feel better. I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so starting with GPU bound on Shadow of the Tomb Raider here, each power profile is about 10 watts apart. So if you notice, manual mode hits like 114 to 120 watts. It will almost hit that full 120 watts when you're like super GPU bound, like a game that's even more GPU bound than this. Turbo mode's like 10 watts less, about 104 watts, and then balance mode is 10 watts less than that, 94 watts. So the temperatures vary, of course. You know, manual mode is running the fans louder, so it has a little bit cooler temps than turbo mode. So like high 70s, low 80s on the GPU, mid 70s on the CPU, which is a great result. Turbo is like mid 80s on the GPU, high 70s on the CPU. Balanced is like low to mid 80s on the GPU, GPU and mid to high 70s, maybe low 80s on the CPU. And then silent mode is just freaking broken. Like it's getting less than half the FPS as the others because that GPU wattage is running way too low here. Like they should have made it like 55 or 60 watts. 45 was a crazy choice. And of course, you know, you can fix this with G-Helper. Like you can instantly fix this with G-Helper and, you know, it'll run a little bit warmer, but you'll get like double the performance. And I'll talk about that here soon. But regardless though, temps across the board are great. Wattage across the board is great. You know, the Ryzen HX 370 doesn't really need more than like 15 to 20 watts when you're in a GPU bound scenario. Remember, like 15 watts on this guy is the equivalent of like 30 to 50 watts on, you know, like the equivalent Raptor Lake CPU from Intel or something. You know, something like the 14900HX. But really quick, you can see how reviewers messed up the G14 when they looked at this thing. You know, a lot of people just run it in like the performance profile or something like that. You're missing out on 20 extra watts if you did that. Even if you ran it in the stock turbo mode, you know, you're missing out on 10 extra watts. And look, like, you know, the difference between balance mode and manual mode is like, what, like 15 to 20 FPS? The difference between turbo and manual mode is like a good, you know, somewhere in the 8 to 10 FPS or more. So that could easily skew results in reviews. And that's what I think happened in a lot of reviews out there, like Crimson Tech's and some other people's. Like, if you're not running it in manual mode with the TGB slider all the way up, then you're not actually letting the laptop use its full wattage. So overall, these GPU bound temperatures are extremely impressive for the amount of wattage that is coming out of this tiny little device. Now, if we instead go over to CPU bound, so think like Valorant, Apex Legends, low resolutions, low settings, things like that, right? So it's going to push your CPU more. You can see the HX 370 doesn't really like to go over 30 watts in games. There are ways to kind of like trick Windows into pushing it higher, but like using the high performance power plan in Windows, but we don't really need to do that, right? Like this CPU gets most of its performance before it even hits 50 watts. So technically, I mean, 30 watts is really all you need out of this guy. You see the GPU is hitting about 85 watts max when we are CPU bound, giving us pretty low temperatures across the board. The only one, again, that's running warm is that balance mode, which for some reason just pushes itself a little bit too far. You know, that is a really high performing balance mode. And then when you're CPU bound, silent mode is a little bit more respectable here, right? That 45 watt GPU limit actually doesn't hurt as much when you're CPU bound. So it's using about 25 to 30 watts on the CPU. And, you know, now we're able to get like that 150 to 160 FPS, whereas the others are getting 220. You know, we're not like less than half anymore of the others. You know, it's pretty much the same case on the 5070 Ti. Temps are essentially the same across the board. I think I actually got a little bit of better factory pace job on the 5070 Ti one, because you can see even like the CPU is running a little bit cooler at the same wattage. So, you know, there's always a little bit of liquid metal lottery. I'm gonna make a whole video about that eventually, but yeah, one thing to keep in mind though, you know, the 5080 has a larger die size than the 5070 Ti, 5060, 5070. So, you know, all things equal, like the, you know, if your factory pace was perfect on both, same wattage, same game, same everything else, the 5080 will actually run like 1 or 2 degrees cooler just because of that extra die surface area. And just remember, manual mode on the 5080 model was hitting like 132 or more FPS right here, whereas this one's hitting like 118. So there definitely is a performance difference between the two. As far as surface temperatures go, on battery, it's really good. It's like mid 20s on the sides of the keyboard and about 30 or so in the center. Underneath the laptop, you know, low to mid 30s in the center. So very comfortable on battery. On silent, it gets a little bit warmer in the center, like mid 30s, and then underneath the laptop, it hits about 40 in the center. But still, that's not gonna burn your legs off or anything. That's still very manageable temperatures. And then when you're like plugged in turbo mode gaming, it's like a little bit toasty in the middle of the laptop at around 45 to 48 degrees Celsius, but the sides still stay really cool, hitting like 29, and then same with like the trackpad area, like hitting the mid 30s. So, I mean, overall, other than like the very center of the laptop, it's pretty good. All right, and I know a lot of you guys are probably excited to hear me talk about the VBIOS swap on the G14. In the 2023 model, we were able to VBIOS swap and run that baby up to 175 watts on that GPU, 4080 or 4090. And you could actually achieve it if you used like a cooling pad or something like that. You could even run it, you know, at that full 160 to 175 watts. If you didn't have a cooling pad, you could, you know, you could probably hit like 140 to 150 and still be pretty fine. The 2025 model, not so much. I mean, the 5080 model, I was able to swap over the GPU to 175 watt VBIOS. I tried a bunch of different ones like the SCAR 16, the HP Omen Max, a few different ones like that. And it was pretty much the same behavior on all of them. And I'm not sure if the GPU temperature reading is changing, but it would start to throttle at around 80 degrees instead of 87. This might require some further tweaking from someone out there who, you know, who maybe wants to invest a little more time in it. But I did find though that you could still push it past that stock wattage. I mean, I was able to get about 130 to 135 watts before it started throttling. So, you know, while that's not a huge improvement, it's still better than stock for those of you who do like to tweak these. And that was just with me lifting the back and maxing the fans out. I'm sure if you used a cooling pad, you could probably push it a little bit further. Like for example, here on the left is like the stock wattage, and then the right is the VBIOS swap. You can see the VBIOS swap is actually running a little bit cooler, you know, because I had those fans maxed out, and the CPU is running at a lower wattage to try and get that GPU wattage up, which of course also helps with temps. And that's something that was just kind of happening dynamically. It wasn't really something that I adjusted on my end. So yeah, that's just kind of the nature of the VBIOS swap on here. To me, I just found it to be a little more beneficial to just keep it at stock wattage and just overclock that, you know, just put like a plus 300 core overclock. It can handle it usually on the 5080, so I found that to be more beneficial in terms of like temps and stable performance. And then the 5070 Ti model, it just didn't really work. I wasn't really able to get more than like 5 extra watts out of it, which was like almost nothing as far as performance goes. So yeah, unfortunately, I can't really say that I recommend a VBIOS swap unless you're just really after tweaking and using a cooling pad and doing all these extra things for that little bit of extra FPS. And I'm going to give you like a starting point of recommended settings if you do get this laptop. I notice a lot of people really mess up on G-Helper or manual mode settings, so I'm kind of just including this to help people out a little bit here. You don't have to do too many crazy things. It's not like a secret code. I notice a lot of people just, you know, make more mistakes than improvements. You see Reddit posts like, help, my laptop gets only 5 FPS, you know, and then you look at their G-Helper settings and it's like 5 watts going to the CPU or something like that. Like, so yeah, hopefully this helps somebody out here. So silent mode, right off the bat, this is like the biggest problem with the G14 is the stock silent mode, which you can easily fix with G-Helper. Like, it's so easy. You can achieve like 80 to 90% of the laptop's peak performance with a lot lower fan noise and maybe just slightly higher temps. Like, for me, that's a worthy sacrifice. So open G-Helper. I usually like to make a new silent profile. Don't just change the stock silent profile. You might actually want that back. So make it a new profile, rename it. I just call this one Silent Better. And most of the time I'm not playing CPU bound games, so I can lower the CPU down to like 18 watts. Honestly, you could probably even go lower than that. You could probably do 14, 15 watts and still be just fine. And I'm actually going to raise the fan curves just a little bit. I want it to hit the peak of its RPMs just a little bit earlier because I don't want it to have to throttle before it gets to that peak RPM. So I set it around like 3,600 to 4,000 RPM, around that 70 to 80 degree mark, which is where things are starting to get a little bit warm. So this can take trial and error, of course. You might have to play with this a little bit, but go ahead and just try that out. Apply a custom fan curve. On the GPU tab, I turn the GPU power and dynamic boost all the way down. This means that the GPU is going to run at a max of 85 watts. I leave the temperature target at 87, but you can lower this if you want it to throttle sooner. You can also lower the core clock limit if you want it to run at below 85 watts using the clock speed instead as a maximum. There's more info on that in my G-Helper video. Advanced tab, this is for Ryzen processors only, but you can set a CPU temp limit here if you desire. Again, that's just setting a throttle limit, but I do like to undervolt because that's just free performance out of your CPU. So just do like minus 20 or so. This will depend on, you know, Silicon Lottery, how low you can go on here, but just hit apply, auto apply, and boom, here you go. Silent mode now hitting about 85 watts on the GPU, about 18 watts on the CPU. Probably doesn't even need that much, but you can see temps here are around 80 degrees on both GPU and CPU, and we're getting excellent above 60 FPS performance on Cyberpunk at ultra settings at 1800p. For a better balance mode, make a new profile. You're going to lower that maximum peak fan speed, but you can raise the other ones. I started around 4,500 RPM, but that was actually a little bit too low, so I had to push it above 5,000 to 5,400 RPM is a good sweet spot here. For the CPU, I did like 22 watts max. Again, for most GPU bound titles, you can set it lower than that. You don't really need it that high. For the GPU, I did a slight overclock, 50 core, 50 memory, and then I upped the GPU power just a little bit, 85 watts plus 10 watts dynamic boost. And then same thing with that advanced tab, you know, minus 20 undervolt, set a CPU temp limit if you desire. And yeah, I mean, the GPU is running a bit warm here, but hey, we're getting amazing performance at much slower fan speeds than the stock balanced in turbo mode. So if you want it to run cooler, you know, just up the fan speeds or lower your CPU wattage or lower your G wattage. But I was plenty happy with this. It wasn't really throttling. It was doing good. For a better turbo mode, I pretty much let it peak at around 6,000 RPM on the fans, maybe a little bit less, because I just find the turbo mode to be way too loud on this guy. So obviously it lowered that peak performance, but I let it hit it a little bit sooner. And I actually let the CPU run dynamically here. I don't even hit the apply checkbox here because I just want the CPU to run at what it wants to run at for turbo mode. So it'll actually dynamically adjust itself depending on the game, whether you're GPU bound or CPU bound. And I find in turbo mode, that's kind of what I want it to do anyway. Now in turbo mode, the 5080 can actually overclock a good bit higher than the 5070 Ti. So I do a 200 core overclock on 5080. You could do like 150 on the 5070 Ti and still be just fine. Remember, that doesn't raise temperatures for a laptop GPU. It's really all about stability. So if games start to crash, then lower that down. And of course, GPU power, I want it to be the maximum possible on turbo mode. So I max these out. And then same thing we did earlier to the CPU under. For me, I actually did have to raise the fans just a little bit. It was a little toasty. So I got them around 6,400 RPM. And yeah, I mean, that was a little bit louder, but hey, we're getting, you know, pretty much the full wattage out of the system, maximum performance, you know, hitting close to like 75 FPS on the ultra settings here. Now, creators are going to like the G14. I mean, it's an awesome laptop for creators. This is where there's less of a difference between the 5080 and 5070 Ti. I think if you're a creator, you probably just want to go with the cheaper option of the two unless you really need that extra VRAM. And here's why. So starting with Photoshop, this one actually has the most difference for some reason. In Photoshop, we're looking at an awesome score of over 9,000 on the 5080 model and then 8229 on the 5070 Ti. In balance mode, the 5080 model is still near the top. Photoshop just loves this CPU for some reason. Photoshop is usually more CPU dependent, so I was surprised that the 5070 Ti model wasn't quite up here because theoretically it should be. Like the Flow Z13, for example, doesn't have the strongest GPU, but that CPU is carrying it to the top. And then finally in silent mode, that's where you see it start to catch up. The 5070 Ti is getting 7900 versus the 5080 getting 8697, almost getting the full performance compared to turbo mode just in silent mode. And the 5070 Ti model oddly is scoring higher in silent mode than it was in turbo mode, which makes me think there's maybe like a bug with Photoshop or something at the time that I ran that benchmark. Because yeah, even on battery, look, the 5070 Ti is pretty much the king on the balance mode on battery, and then 5080 slightly surpasses it in silent mode on battery. So if you're doing Photoshop on battery, like there you go. These are like the two best that I've measured for that. Premiere Pro is definitely more reliant on the GPU, scoring a little over 11,000 on the 5080, almost 11,000 on the 5070 Ti. I was surprised to see the 5070 Ti G16 surpass these here, but that is very likely because of Intel QuickSync. Pretty much the same story on balance mode. 5080 and 5070 Ti are actually even closer here, and then same thing on silent mode. They pretty much scored the same. And on battery is where these guys once again really shine here. In the silent mode on battery, they're pretty middle of the line, not bad at all. DaVinci Resolve relies on a pretty good mix of CPU and GPU here, mostly GPU. And this is where the 5080 has a bit more of a lead. Maybe not in like the basic version of this benchmark, but you can see in the standard version, we're getting 8819 versus 8176. So that's your more GPU accelerated benchmark. So if you're doing a lot of GPU acceleration, fusion tasks, things like that, the 5080 will come in handy more here. However, they do start to catch up when it comes to balance mode and silent mode, pretty much becoming equivalent at that point. And the same can be said on battery. In balance mode, the 5070 Ti does a little better. In silent mode, the 5080 does a little better. And then I run this one on USB-C power delivery to give you a good idea of what you expect there. And this is just another one of those moments where for some reason the 5070 Ti does better on USB-C power delivery than the 5080 model. So I think it's probably just a bug, but yeah. And then latency mon, not looking too bad. It looks like the NVIDIA driver is causing a little bit of a hiccup there, but overall I've seen much worse here. And then another thing I like to do for creators is for music producers out there, I run an Ableton benchmark, which you can easily replicate on your machine to see how you stack up by just running the stock Ableton 11 or 12 demo session that's built into the software, even if you download the free demo, which runs like a ton of tracks and effects to give you an idea of how it performs. So for this one, we want to see our CPU meter at a lower level, which means it's performing better. So we're hitting about like the high teens to low 20% here, which is a really good result. I will say that Intel 285H was beating it a little bit here, staying more into the, the 16 to 20% versus like this one being like more in the 20 to 23%, especially on Ableton 11. But again, that's not a really bad result at all. So can't really complain. This will be a great laptop either way for music producers. Let's look at how the G14 performs in games. So, the goal here is we want it to look better than the 4080 and 4090 G14 from 2023. That's overall what we would like to see, right? If this laptop, which is even thinner and lighter than its 2023 counterpart with, more premium features, can it perform better in this smaller chassis? Because we already know the 5080 and 5090 GPUs from NVIDIA, if you haven't been following, they're not much of an upgrade. Like it's really almost nothing compared to the 4080 and 4090. However, the 5070 Ti is a pretty good upgrade over like a 4070. So anyways, let's check it out. Starting with Apex Legends. You see the 5080 model here is getting 236 FPS and the 5070 Ti model is getting about 225. So really small difference there. But look, that 5070 Ti model is pretty much tied with the 4090 from 2023, despite, just some lower 1% lows. And this is a CPU bound game, so that is expected. In balance mode, they're pretty much the same, just a few FPS apart. Actually, the 5070 Ti is a few FPS ahead. But then moving on to Black Myth Wukong, which has a good amount of GPU in it, you're getting 64 FPS on the 5080, 58 FPS on the 5070 Ti, both of which are beating like last year's 4090 G16 and the year before's 4090 G14. So that's really good to see. Moving on to Call of Duty, we're getting 98 FPS on the 5080 model, 89 FPS on the 5070 Ti. Surprisingly, the 5080 model is like almost tied with the 5090 G16 here. It's like the only game the 5090 G16 does not like to hit 100 FPS on this specific benchmark. We're at like the extreme settings here, but yeah, like that's weird. But hey, again, both are beating the 4090 G16, which means both are going to be beating, the 4090, 4080 G14 from 2023 here too. It's kind of the same deal in balance mode. The 5080 model is hitting about what the 5070 Ti did in turbo mode on balanced. Next we have Cyberpunk, which is like probably one of the most all-encompassing benchmarks you can do. So I like to run this one at a few different graphics presets because it's really good at capturing all the sorts of performance that you'd be likely to see in other modern games. So on the RT Ultra preset, which uses DLSS, 5080 G14 is hitting 66 FPS, so pretty much tied with the 4090 G16 and 4090 G14. Whereas the 5070 Ti model is a few FPS behind, but not too far. In balanced and silent mode, the 5080 is holding pretty strong at about 59 FPS. 5070 Ti is only 5 FPS behind it, and then in silent mode, the 5080 G14 is tied with the 5080 Legion Pro 7i here. And then the 5070 Ti does fall a bit behind in silent mode. That's because that GPU just goes down to 45 watts, and that is not enough. And then on the regular Ultra preset, the 5070 Ti model 85 FPS, 5080 models hitting 92. And it's cool to see that up there. I mean, it's like beating, the Legion Pro 7i, which had a full powered 4080 and a really powerful CPU. Like, we're getting a couple more FPS than that. So that's really nice. In balance mode, the 5080 G14 is pretty much tied with the 4090 G14 here, and the 5070 Ti is just a couple FPS behind them. While in silent mode, they both fall pretty far behind. All right, ray tracing overdrive. This is super GPU dependent, right? We're hitting 79 FPS on the 5080, 66 FPS on the 5070 Ti. You might notice by now, like the G16 and G14 5070 Ti models pretty much trade blows depending on the game. Like, they're always within a couple FPS of each other. Sometimes the G14, despite having 5 less watts on its GPU, will actually pull a little bit ahead of the G16. I think that's really just the CPU thing. Like, if the gamer benchmark prefers AMD or Intel, really that's the only reason that you see, sometimes a few FPS for one over the other. Now, if we bump it up to 4K, so I mean, we're almost completely GPU dependent now. We're getting 48 FPS on the 5080, 39 FPS on the 5070 Ti. So you can see, like, as we get more GPU dependent, the distance between these two GPUs starts to become much greater. And don't get scared of this graph, I'll explain it, but I just want to talk about frame gen a little bit because I know a lot of people are going to be curious about that. So the G14 at 3x frame gen, 109 on the 5080, 98 on the 5070 Ti. At 4x frame gen, again, they're about 10 FPS apart. One thing to keep in mind here though, like the G14 at its 4x frame gen is just a little bit better than the G16 is with its 3x frame gen, at the 5090 level. So that is something to keep in mind. Like, if you're gonna be a heavy frame gen user, it is worth going for those higher tier GPUs. But like I said in previous reviews, I was pleasantly surprised by how good frame gen was. Like, I wouldn't use it in like multiplayer, but for single player games, man, I'm turning this thing on every time. I don't even care. In Forza Horizon 5, the 5080 G14 is actually decently close to the 5090 G16 in this game. But to be fair, like, this was probably one of the worst performing games for the 5090 G16. Either way though, like, the 5070 Ti is only 5 FPS behind the 5080 in this one, so really good for both of these guys here. And this is one where the 5070 Ti G14 surpasses the 5070 Ti G16 by a good bit. Look at that, 121 versus 112. Not to mention passing the 4090 G14 by a lot too, which tells me that the CPU has a lot to do with these results here in this game. In balance mode, the 5080 G14 is actually nearing the top of the charts. Even the 5070 Ti is looking really good here. In silent mode, they lose a lot of performance, but still not a bad result overall. Helldivers 2, once again, we're looking really good on the G14, both the 5070 Ti and the 5080 model. You get a decent bit of lead here actually for the 5080, going from 116 to 127. You actually surpass the Blade 16 5090 on the G14 5080 in this game. And then once again, the 5070 Ti is pretty much tied right around the previous year's 4090 models. In balance mode, they're looking even better. Both the 5070 Ti and 5080 are near the top of the charts now, except for in silent mode where they both fall short by quite a bit. This is one where you would definitely want to use G-Helper's silent mode if you wanted to play this game with quiet fans. Horizon Zero Dawn 5080 G14 is about 7 FPS behind the 5090 G16, so that's surprisingly close. And then 5070 Ti is at 116, pretty close to the 4090 G16 from last year, and certainly way ahead of these 4070 laptops. If we drop it to balance mode, the 5080 G14 is actually matching the 5090 G16. Meanwhile, the 5070 Ti is still sitting in a really good spot, about 109 FPS. However, silent mode, both of these guys slow way down here, and they're a little bit towards the bottom. In 4K, we're hitting 77 FPS on the 5080 G14, which is surpassing, the 2023 4090 G14. It's surpassing the 2024 4090 G16, so that's a really good result. Meanwhile, the 5070 Ti is hitting 71 FPS, not too far below that 4090 level. And then in 1080p, where we're actually more reliant on the CPU here, we're looking at 148 FPS on the 5080, 138 FPS on 5070 Ti, both of which are surpassing the 4090 G14. Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which stresses the GPU and CPU quite a bit, we're looking at 152 FPS on the G14 5080, 136 FPS on the 5070 Ti. So you're probably seeing the pattern here is like they both fall in the same spot pretty much between, you know, the 4090 G16 and the 4090 G14 throughout almost every benchmark here. Sadly, it's kind of rare to see them in the same ballpark as like these full wattage 4090 laptops from last year, and definitely not in the same ballpark as like the full wattage 5080 and 5090 laptops. But, you know, that's more of an NVIDIA problem. They should have at least made the 5080 a little bit more performant, and that's not really the fault of the G14 here. But either way, I mean, this is still amazing performance out of a 14-inch laptop. And the gap typically narrows as you see when we get to balance mode, like 139 FPS on the 5080, 134 FPS on the 5070 Ti. In 4K, where we're a lot more GPU dependent, we're looking at 83 FPS on the 5080, 74 FPS on the 5070 Ti. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is another one that I run on 1080p for more of that pure CPU performance, and you can see this is where they all start to fall behind a little bit because they don't get as much of that peak CPU performance as like those Raptor Lake chips and the Core Ultra 275HX. But, you know, still not looking too bad. The G14 actually surpasses the G16 here, and that's because of that HX370 CPU giving it a little bit more performance than the Ultra 285H. But I mean, they're pretty much neck and neck, 174 versus 173. On battery, the 5080 G14 does start to struggle a little bit, falling behind some of these 4070 laptops. And, you know, 58 FPS, not super great, but definitely still playable. Same thing with USB-C power delivery. They're not too bad. The 5070 Ti is slightly better than the 5080 here, likely due to that extra GPU efficiency at lower wattages. 66 FPS and 61 FPS on the 5080, so not terrible, but it's still underneath a lot of 4070 laptops on this chart. And then if you happen to be gaming on the integrated graphics, you know, it's not bad actually. It's near the top of the charts, 42 FPS. The only thing better was like the G16 with the Ryzen HX370. Really not sure why, since these are both the same iGPU, but whatever. All right, so in conclusion, the G14 is the most portable 14-inch gaming laptop you can buy, the most powerful 14-inch gaming laptop you can buy by a long shot. You know, it's got an extremely premium metal build quality. It's got a glass trackpad, some of the best speakers on any Windows laptop, beautiful OLED display, great battery life. You've got a really efficient and powerful CPU, especially for a 14-inch laptop. It's got 120 watts going to the GPU, which very impressive for something this thin and light. You got about 80 watts or so going to the CPU, which again, very impressive for something like this. The RTX 5070 Ti configuration is an amazing sweet spot here. You've got G Helper, which is like the best laptop software out there. You've got Ryzen CPU undervolting on this CPU. So yeah, there's a lot of pros there. Cons, the fans are extremely loud, way louder than the 2023 model, much louder than the 2024 as well. You've got pretty poor stock silent mode performance, which you can fix with G Helper, but still kind of sad to see it out of the box like that. Performance on USB-C power delivery is bad. There isn't like a true USB-C pass-through going on here, and if it is, it's really hard to detect because it's acting super finicky, but you know, this could be like a BIOS update fix or something. Keyboard temps, they're slightly warm in the middle, but it's not too much of a con. And then the rest really is mostly nitpicks from me, like, you know, the gamer font, that'd be nice to get rid of. You know, and single zone RGB, like, come on, Asus, like, can we please get some perky RGB on these guys? The NVIDIA Studio driver is kind of weird, like, that shouldn't really be the pre-installed one, I don't think. They also could have maxed it out at a 5090 for, you know, just for like the super enthusiasts who would have paid the extra. Not a lot of people would have got it, but you know, it would have been nice to have. And lastly, it's not really an Asus con, but really just NVIDIA. Like, this is just not a good year for NVIDIA GPUs outside of like, you know, the 5070 Ti. That's the new G14, you know, and if we look at it in comparison to the 2023 model, like, yeah, it does have pretty similar time spy scores. It might even be a little bit less than that one, but it actually does outperform it in most games. Even the 5070 Ti model actually will outperform the 4090 G14 sometimes, or at least come close to it in most games. So, I mean, that's pretty nice if you really wanted, you know, that level of performance in this form factor. Like the display, the speakers, the metal build quality, all of that is amazing. It's slightly thicker than last year's if you're getting the 5070 Ti or 5080 because you have this little bump at the bottom, but you really wouldn't tell unless you had this one like right next to the last year's model. Otherwise, I mean, really it's like an extended spec bump from the 2024 G14. You get the new CPU that's giving you more cores and more power with like similar battery life, and then you get the 50 series GPUs from NVIDIA, but you know, we're getting that extension upwards to the 5080 model, which I love that we're actually getting the return of an 80 series on a laptop like this because no one else is doing that. Like even the 5070 Ti, like as of making this review, this is the only laptop that even goes up to that GPU. All the other ones I know of only go up to a 5070. So this is really your 14-inch powerhouse king right here, because the 5070 Ti is an amazing GPU. So I don't know if Asus like cut a deal with NVIDIA or something, but man, it worked. I mean, the performance difference between the 5070 and the 5070 Ti, it's big, especially when you're VRAM limited. Like you're getting 12 gigs gigs of VRAM, which is really future proofing, and we need that in 2025. So it's nice to see like a properly performing GPU from NVIDIA and to see it in a device like this. And even the 5080, I know like a lot of people are quoting this Crimson Tech video where he showed the 5070 Ti and 5080 were pretty much the same, or 5080 was even falling behind. In reality, that is not the case at all. You know, he may have had a faulty unit or bad liquid metal application from the factory. In reality, there is actually a difference there, and it's not really to be taken lightly. I mean, it's about a 15% increase in FPS on average, depending on the game, going from the 5070 Ti to the 5080. And for some people, that is absolutely worth it, especially for enthusiasts or people who really need more VRAM. It's worth that extra cost. I mean, I think it is. But in the US, it is 30% more money for this 5080 model, so, you know, that's also not nothing either. And another thing to add on the 5080 over the 5070 Ti is the overclocking ability. That chip can be easily overclocked, you know, to like plus 300, plus 350 core and still be super stable. Also on top of that, you know, getting like the balance mode of the 5080 to run around like what the manual mode of the 5070 Ti is, like that's kind of a joy, you know, lower fan speeds, technically like same performance as that one at lower fan speeds. That's kind of the beauty of the 5080 model, but I'm going to make a whole video comparing these to go more in depth on that, so make sure you're subscribed for that. I was surprised to see the 5080 even coming close to the 5090 G16 in some games, so that's pretty cool to see. And you know, at the lower GPU configurations like the 5060 or 5070, that's where there's like a bit more competition in the 14-inch market, like, you know, Acer, Razer, they're starting to look a lot better when you get to that GPU configuration. But you know, that's when it comes down to like what you personally prefer, what you're getting for a better price, you know, what fits your needs better, your preferences. So yeah, if you can live with the fan noise on this guy, like you're someone who plays with headphones primarily, or maybe you just consider yourself like a master of like tweaking fans and temperatures on G-Helper, then look no further. This is the best 14-inch laptop out there. You really can't beat this. So yeah, I mean, as of making this review, the G14 is still my favorite 14-inch gaming laptop by a lot. If you're someone who likes to have that portability and this much power in this small of a package, well, there you go. And if you decide you like it enough to buy it or something, I do greatly appreciate using my links, which helps support the channel. So just throwing that out there. And of course, the same thing goes for liking, commenting, and subscribing. So if you haven't already, I greatly appreciate that. Anyways, thanks so much, guys. I'll see y'all in the next one.